The Boat by J.P. O'Brien.
"Captain,"
I said tentatively.
"do you know how I got here? I'm afraid I don't remember anything."
There was an old man standing in front of me with his back turned, 1 foot up on the very front of the tiny wooden rowboat that was carrying the two of us gently along in the serene water. He didn't answer, though he must have heard me. There was hardly any distance between us, and barely the sound of wind or waves. But I wondered if he even knew I was here. I looked around. On all sides of us were miles and miles of empty, calm blue ocean as far as I could see, and it was just the two of us in the middle of it. The boat that carried us looked beaten and old, and I found it strange that it could have possibly made it this far away from land at all. It didn't appear to have an engine, although there was a cracked and paint-chipped oar lying across the wooden bench just in front of me. I examined the man more closely. He was wearing a long white coat that reached to the back of his knees, and he was staring out intently at the horizon as it merged indistinctly with the wide blue sky, as though he were trying to hear what it was saying. His hands were slotted casually into his trouser pockets, bunching his coat up at the waist in a pose that reminded me of the way successful men stand. Though he was turned away from me and his face remained a mystery, the tense lines on the back of his neck below his tidy white haircut made me believe he was frowning. While I waited for the captain to turn around, I patiently listened to the meditative creak as our vessel swayed very gently in the almost motionless sea, with me sitting on the bench at the very back. Beside me there was a bunched-up pillow, which bore a childish sailboat pattern on it, like you might find in a nursery. I could hear the occasional slosh of water slapping lightly against the outside of the hull. I then looked down and saw my thin, boyish knees coming out of my colourful pyjama shorts. Once again, I tried to get the old man's attention.
"Please, sir, I'm terribly confused. I don't really know where I am. I'm sorry to bother you. Could you please help me?"
"Where you are," said the captain abruptly, without turning around, "is not what matters." He spoke in a very soft Irish accent, and his voice was not at all how I imagined a sea captain would sound. His words were neither harsh nor weathered. Instead, he rolled his round R's in a soft and pleasing way that somehow felt soothing, almost dripping with confidence. "It's where you're going that's why I'm here. We'll get you there."
"Oh, I see,"
I said, although that wasn't strictly true. Despite his cryptic answer, I nonetheless felt compelled to believe him, although I had still not seen the man's face. I didn't know how else I was going to get back home. Besides which, he didn't seem to be too worried about our predicament, floating in the middle of nowhere like this. He just kept standing there, staring into the distance with his foot confidently on the front of the boat, hands in pockets and his back turned. So I sat where I was, reached to clutch onto the pillow beside me for comfort, and waited to see what happened. After a while, I was starting to feel hungry. The old man hadn't yet said anything else to me, and nothing about our surroundings had really changed at all. I didn't want to bother him again, but I did wonder if we were going to be able to eat soon.
"Captain,"
I said meekly, trying to be as polite as possible.
"I understand it doesn't matter where I am."
He cocked an ear slightly towards me.
"But are we going to somewhere where there will be food?"
He returned his head to the direction it had been facing, observed the calm ocean in front of us again for a few thoughtful seconds, then unexpectedly spun around and gave me my first look at him from the front. I could see now that he had some sort of quite severe wound just above one of his eyes, which gave him a noticeable swelling on that temple, but the rest of his face appeared kind. Curiously, underneath his long coat, he was wearing a baby blue button-down shirt and patterned tie, and I could see the tops of several pens sticking out of his breast pocket. I had not expected him to be dressed that way at all, given where we were, but I was so puzzled by his strange clothing that I thankfully didn't have a chance to gasp out loud at his facial wound and risk offending him. I looked again. It seemed to me like he had been slashed with a knife to the face and had since healed only partially. "I'll get you something to eat, my boy." He paused. "But you'll need to trust me." I nodded silently. He looked down into the water just beside the boat and began shifting his eyes from point to point on the surface, as if searching for something valuable he had dropped. When he had rejected the left side of the boat, he shifted over to the right. Quickly, he said, "Ah, there we go," and knelt down to hunch over the side. He plunged an arm aggressively into the water, almost toppling over, with his head just barely avoiding breaking the surface, but pulled his arm out again in one controlled, rapid motion. In his clenched fist, he now held a sleek, metallic, silver-blue fish, about the length of his torso, which frantically flopped to try to escape. His coat sleeve was dripping, but he did not seem to even notice. While clasping the fish tightly in one hand, he retrieved with his other a small knife from one of his inside coat pockets. The knife was not at all what I thought a fisherman would use. It looked to me much more like a scalpel belonging to a surgeon, tiny and intricate. I remained still. He inspected the creature's underside more closely and brought the blade to its light-shaded belly, drawing it in a smooth line down the length of the fish, which ceased flailing about and eventually stopped moving altogether. The captain, meanwhile, efficiently ripped out what appeared to be all of the guts and innards of the poor thing in one go with the point of the blade, then flicked them casually back into the ocean. From nowhere, a circle of birds gathered above us, evidently attracted by the stench of the flesh. I began to feel a little queasy. "Fresh fish," the captain announced with a mischievous smile. I found the unusual swelling scar on the side of his forehead to be all the more menacing when he bared his teeth, and I couldn't tell if he was serious about offering it to me. "Is that really all right to eat?" I asked. "Oh, it should be," he remarked. "The flesh is the nourishing part. Without its inside bits, there won't be any nasty stuff left." He could probably see my cheeks losing their colour as he spoke. "It depends how hungry you really are, I suppose," he added quietly. I decided I wasn't that desperate to eat after all. A little later, I noticed some dark clouds had started to gather on the horizon ahead of us. They had broken up the tranquility of the peaceful blue sky and were making me feel nervous. The captain had also been watching them with a critical glint in his eye, as if deep in thought. He had still said barely more than a sentence to me, but I had left him to focus on whatever it was that occupied him. All of a sudden, he reached down for the oar and shoved the paddle end aggressively into the water. The surprise of it gave me a fright. Around us, the previously still sea was starting to swell more roughly, and I could feel the boat rocking more than it had been doing before. I asked him if we were in any trouble, and if the clouds were going to reach us. "Don't worry, lad," he said. "I've seen one or two dark clouds like that in my time. I'd say you'll be all right." He explained simply that there was a storm on its way, a particularly rough one by the looks of it, but he promised to do everything he could to get us to safety. He'd need to paddle hard, but not to worry, it was a preventative measure. As he said so, he began powering the boat by expertly driving the oar through the waves on one side of us, occasionally flipping it over to paddle on the other side, all the while with his back to me. I sat timidly in silence on the rear bench and tried to hold on. As we moved, however, the waves were picking up their pace. I felt myself growing more scared and, for some reason, feeling increasingly weak. In the distance, I thought I could hear the beeping of machines and arguments between panicked, muffled voices, but there was no one besides the two of us in the boat. Though the captain was trying to navigate us parallel with the approaching storm, it was moving just too fast, and the sky was growing more dark by the second. By now, We were quite violently rocking, and water was sloshing into the boat and wetting us. I tucked my feet up onto the bench and wrapped my arms around my knees for safety. Eventually, and despite the captain's best efforts, the full force of the storm caught us, and we were now getting pummeled by water, not just from all sides, but also from the thick drops of rain pelting us from above. Amongst the chaos, the captain was trying to remain as focused as possible on maintaining our course, but I was shielding my face with my arms, as much to protect my eyes from the salty seawater that was flying all around as out of fear. With a terrific boom, a blast of thunder exploded directly overhead. I was knocked onto the deck of the boat, water furiously churning in on top of me. Through the noise, I could just about hear the captain's raised voice as he spoke to me, but I could not make out the bubbling words. They became faint, and after a moment, everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was back here. You have been listening to JP O'Brien's stories. For more, visit patreon.com/JP O'Brien Stories.